Chapter 1. The Night of Shadows. The moon hung low and full in the night sky, casting an eerie glow over the village of Eldenwood. The narrow cobblestone streets were bathed in silver light, and the simple thatched-roof cottages appeared peaceful under its oft illumination. But this peace was a fragile veneer, for lurking within the shadows was an ancient curse, a malevolent force waiting to be unleashed. Markus was only 7 years old, a bright-eyed boy with a head full of unruly dark curls and a heart full of curiosity. He lived with his mother, father, and grandfather on the outskirts of Eldenwood, in a sturdy stone house that had seen many generations of his family. They were known as the village's protectors, monster hunters by trade, sworn to defend their home against the darkness that often crept from the dense surrounding forests. Markus's family didn't choose their trade of monster hunting. No, it was passed down from generations before. Their library contained the deepest, darkest secrets of this world. Young Markus could never fully understand the sacrifice that was given to put ink to parchment, to give the next in line and better understanding of what goes bump in the night. Each manuscript detailed an ancestor's discovery, and as only one could hope, how the creature was dispatched. It was early autumn when the band of gypsies arrived in Eldenwood. Their colorful wagons and lively music seemed to breathe life into the village, but the villagers greeted them with suspicion and hostility. The gypsies bartered their wares and even put on a puppet show for the children of the village. Markus watched as the puppets danced and sang songs. He also saw the end where a particularly monstrous puppet, all covered in fur, attacked the other puppets. As the puppets lay on their side, the monstrous puppet simulated the tearing of flesh from bone. Markus turned away as some of the children screamed and began to run to their mother's arms. The villagers were appalled by this display of violence and forced the gypsies to leave within days, driving them away with harsh words and angry glares. Markus had watched the scene unfold from behind his mother's skirts, sensing the tension but not fully understanding its implications. He couldn't have known that this act of cruelty would seal their fate. These gypsies were no ordinary travelers. They hailed from a cursed lineage, their ancestors having struck deals with demons and perhaps the devil himself. They were outcasts, doomed to roam the land, and when the full moon rose, they transformed into monstrous beasts with a ravenous thirst for human flesh. Several weeks passed after the gypsies' departure. Life in Eldenwood returned to its usual rhythm, and the villagers began to forget the travelers and the unease they had brought with them. Markus continued his training under the watchful eyes of his family, learning the skills necessary to one day join their ranks as a monster hunter. His father, a stern yet loving man, would often spar with him in the yard, teaching him the finer points of sword play, while his mother showed him how to track creatures through the forest, her eyes always scanning the horizon for signs of danger. One crisp evening, Markus was helping his grandfather mend a broken fence when a chill wind blew through the village, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. The old man paused, his weathered hands stilling on the wooden post, and he gazed out towards the darkening forest. "There's a storm coming, lad," he muttered, his voice heavy with unease. "Best get inside before night falls." Markus nodded and followed his grandfather back to the house, glancing over his shoulder at the ominous clouds gathering on the horizon. As night fell, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like the mournful wail of a lost soul. The howling continued into a chorus that seemed to be coming closer and closer. Markus became fearful and unnerved by the incessant noise accompanying the storm. Then, just as soon as the howling started, it ceased. Now, just the whirling noise of the wind against the trees and the knocking of a shutter blowing against the house replaced it. Markus lay in his bed, listening to the wind battering the house, his mind drifting back to the night the gypsies had been driven from the village. He wondered where they were now, and if they had found a place to call home. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden sharp cry from outside. He bolted upright, his heart pounding in his chest. The cry was followed by another, and then another, until the night was filled with the sound of terrified screams. Markus leapt from his bed and rushed to the window, his eyes widening in horror at the sight before him. Shadows moved through the village, dark hulking shapes that prowled with an unnatural grace. The moon, now fully risen, cast its pale light on the monstrous figures, revealing their true nature. Werewolves. Markus had seen them depicted in a manuscript once. The hunter that faced one spoke of its beastly tenacity and unquenched thirst for flesh. The hunter detailed that the beast's claws were like knives and its teeth daggers. The hunter nearly met their fate in a pitched battle with the beast. His sword had struck the beast many times without falling it. It was only by chance that his last swing severed the head of the beast, causing its body to slump and fall. The hunter watched as the beast transformed back into the man it was before. Markus once thought this story was more fable than fact, but as he peered through the window of his home, he knew his worst nightmare was upon them. The werewolves moved through the village with deadly efficiency, tearing through doors and windows, dragging villagers into the streets. The air was thick with the scent of blood and fear. Markus's father burst into his room, his face set in a grim mask of determination. "Markus, get to the barn," he ordered, his voice brooking no argument. "Now." Markus hesitated for a moment, his eyes locking with his father's before he nodded and fled the house. He raced across the yard, his heart hammering in his chest, and climbed the ladder to the hayloft. He burrowed into the straw, his small body shaking with fear. From his hiding place, he could hear the sounds of battle as the werewolves descended upon the village. Growls and snarls mixed with the screams of villagers as they were torn apart by the ravenous beasts. He heard his family fighting bravely, his father's voice roaring commands, his mother's cries of defiance, and his grandfather's battle-hardened shouts. But one by one, their voices fell silent. First, his mother's voice was silenced, a high-pitched scream cut short. Markus bit his lip to keep from crying out, tears streaming down his cheeks. Then, his grandfather's voice faded, a guttural growl marking his end. Finally, his father's voice, strong and fierce until the last, was drowned out by the howls of the beasts. Markus lay in the hayloft, his hands clamped over his mouth to stifle his sobs. The night was filled with the sounds of slaughter, and he could hear the werewolves prowling around the barn, their heavy footsteps and low growls sending waves of terror through his small body. He held his breath, praying they wouldn't find him. Hours passed, though it felt like an eternity. Eventually, the sounds of the beasts grew distant, and silence fell over the village. Markus waited until the first light of dawn before he dared to move. He climbed down from the hayloft on trembling legs and cautiously opened the barn door. The sight that greeted him was a scene of utter devastation. Bodies lay scattered across the ground, the lifeless forms of villagers mingling with the corpses of the slain werewolves. The air was thick with the scent of blood and death. He stumbled through the carnage, searching for his family. He found them near the edge of the village, surrounded by the bodies of the monsters they had fought so valiantly. His mother's face was peaceful in death, his grandfather's expression fierce, even in his final moments. His father lay nearby, his sword still clutched in his hand, his body covered in the blood of the beasts he had slain. Markus fell to his knees, his small body racked with sobs. He was alone, an orphan in a world filled with monsters. The days that followed were a blur of grief and confusion. The surviving villagers, few as they were, took pity on the orphaned boy. They buried his family and tried to care for him, but their own losses left them with little to give. Markus wandered the village, a ghost of his former self, until one day the Knights of the King's Guard arrived. They had been sent by the king to investigate the tragedy at Eldenwood. Sir Aldrich was a stern, battle-hardened knight, with a heart softened by the sight of the orphaned boy. He took Markus under his wing, bringing him to the castle where he served. There, Markus was given food, shelter, and a chance to learn the art of combat. Sir Aldrich became both a mentor and a father figure to the boy, teaching him how to wield a sword, shoot a bow, and fight with the ferocity of a true warrior. Years passed, and Markus grew into a formidable young man. At 21 he was tall and strong. His dark hair flowed past his shoulders, and his once bright eyes hardened by the loss he had endured. He wore the armor of a King's Guard knight, the emblem of the royal family emblazoned on his chest, but his heart still carried the scars of that terrible night in Eldenwood. One evening Markus found himself in a dimly lit tavern, nursing a tankard of ale. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. He sat alone, his mind wandering back to his childhood, to the family he had lost and the monsters that had taken them from him. A grizzled old man, his face lined with age, and his eyes sharp with curiosity, sidled up to Markus and took a seat beside him. "You're a quiet one," the old man remarked, his voice rough but friendly. "What brings a Knight of the King's Guard to a place like this?" Markus looked up, his gaze weary. "Just passing through," he replied, his voice flat. The old man chuckled. "Aye, aren't we all? But I heard an interesting tale the other day. Thought you might find it of interest." Markus raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. "What kind of tale?" "The kind about gypsies," the old man said, lowering his voice. "They say there's a band of them living in the hills 3 days' ride from here. Strange folk they are. Some say they're cursed, that they're more than they seem." Markus's heart skipped a beat. Could it be the same gypsies who had slaughtered his family all those years ago? The same cursed lineage that had turned into beasts under the full moon? The old man leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "They say the full moon is coming in a few nights. If you're looking for something, or someone, you might find them then." Markus drained his tankard and set it down with a determined thud. His mind was made up. He had trained for years, honed his skills, and now it was time to face the monsters that had haunted his dreams for so long. He would find these gypsies, and if they were indeed the same ones who had murdered his family, he would have his revenge. As he left the tavern, the moon was just beginning to rise, its pale light a reminder of the horrors that lurked in the night. But Markus was no longer the frightened boy hiding in the hayloft. He was a knight, a warrior, and he was ready to confront the darkness. The hunt had begun.